Hi guys, AJ here. Welcome back to LAWS14006, Evaluating Legal Risk and Systems. And this is week 7, and this week we are looking at Chapter 5 of Whaling Gazillion, which is non-contractual obligations risk. And it's an interesting little chapter in the text because it's really not something that is terribly amenable to finding loads of certainty, hard parameters, the availability of hard data. So it relies more squarely on the softer kind of issues that we started to discuss last week when we were talking about corporate culture or organisational culture. So it's looking at the broader notions of doing the right thing, complying with the spirit of the law, and broad notions of a duty of care. And they identify 4 broad areas that organisations will, generally speaking, need to think about when they are thinking of their broad duties of care. And they identify the environment, first up, the market, shareholders, and customers. And I don't think this is intended to be any kind of exhaustive list of the kinds of sectors that you would owe broad duties of care to. I mean, two further ones spring to mind to me, and that would be, well, you've looked externally to, from the organisation. What about internally? So what about the duties of care that you would owe, for example, to your employees? And that would obviously house all of your workplace health and safety and well-being kinds of concerns there, bullying, harassment, and so forth. What about that more ephemeral notion of society? Do you owe a duty, a broad duty to do the right thing in terms of society? I mean, we're getting a lot of discussion nowadays around corporate social responsibility, social innovation, and all of that kind of thing. So I think their list is not trying to be exhaustive. I think it's just meant to give you a little bit of a taster of the kinds of sectors that you would more than likely need to cater for when you're doing a risk assessment. Interestingly, they make the comment that each of these 4 broad areas or sectors that they see an organisation might have some duty towards or responsibility for, each of these sectors has a fairly well-developed regulatory arena that specifies what will be and will not be acceptable conduct by players in the market, by organisations. And they say, well, can't you really just couch this as an issue of legislative and regulatory risk like we were discussing last week? And they say, well, no, you can't just focus on compliance with the relevant laws, the relevant regulatory environment at any particular stage, because you're not going to be doing your horizon scanning and thinking laterally about new risks that might emerge in those areas, and therefore you need to have recourse to this broad notion of a duty of care in these sectors. So you need to be having in mind not just a compliance regime in terms of the regulatory environment that you're operating in for that particular sector that you have responsibility for. You need to be worrying about whether or not your organisational culture is developing that kind of attitude of, well, we're going to not only comply with the letter of the law, we're going to comply with the spirit of the law as well. So that softer underbelly, if you will, of behavioural regulation that we need to take into account when we're talking about duties of care and responsibilities. And in their search for some guidance as to these responsibilities, They look towards a decision in the California Supreme Court which sets out 7 different tests for determining whether or not you might have a case in torts. I guess it's a fairly understandable search for some certainty and some bright lines in an area which is kind of fraught with difficulty and has very few bright lines. The factors in the Supreme Court decision are not anything magical. A lot of them are already covered off in our own tort law, and particularly our law of negligence. 2 that stand out as not necessarily being appropriate in our jurisdiction are considerations of moral blameworthiness, and also, taking into account the deterrence factor. I've put a link in your readings for a nice little article by a fellow called Goodcamp, who very nicely teases apart the idea of moral blameworthiness in the law of negligence, and identifies quite a number of factors which would tend to suggest that the area of morality and whether or not the defendant is morally culpable is not necessarily completely coextensive with tort law in the area of negligence. There are quite a few factors that he identifies where the 2 are quite separate, and I'll leave it to you to explore that resource. But even Whaley and Gazzellian kind of make the comment that, with this California Supreme Court case and the 7 tests there, these need to be taken into account in a jurisdictionally sensitive manner. So they recognise really that these are just kind of broad ideas to help people make it through the sometimes murky process of risk assessment in this area. They're really just there to give you a bit of a guideline, if you will. And the other thing I wanted to draw your attention to in this week's readings was Whaley and Gazzellian's discussion as they move on from talking about compliance with the spirit of the law and these kinds of guidelines that can be used towards, focusing on how the regulators view the whole area of regulating behaviour and conduct, and how there's been a shift in regulatory attitude towards ethics, morality, values. They're all different things, as Whaley and Gazzellian point out. But behavioural economics really has taken quite a hold in the regulatory arena, and this rather emergent new branch of economics is quite at odds with the usual traditional thought that runs behind most economic theory, which is that humans are rational. We're going to choose what's best for us. We're going to pursue the conduct that is in our own best self-interest. And it says, well, no, actually people are quite irrational. They don't like to make decisions. Decisions are actually quite taxing on them. They'll rely on the nearest information at hand, and often the way that that information is presented to the decision maker will have quite a strong bearing on the ultimate decision that's made. People want, they want their decisions to be made easy for them, and if they can have information that's, quick to access and simple to see, then that's the kind of information that will more than likely be used in the ultimate decision that gets made. People are not the best judges of what's in their own best interests quite often, and therefore governments and institutions, regulators, agencies are probably in a better position, so the theory goes, of behavioural economics, to help frame information that consumers might use to make decisions that will nudge them into making the decision that's best for them. It's interesting because it tends to justify a more paternalistic attitude to regulation. It has been taken on board with gusto by regulators like ASIC, and I have put a link to a nice, relatively recent speech by an ASIC official outlining how ASIC has put in this new behavioural economics branch into their department. And they are using behavioural economics at various stages of their operations, for example, to understand decisions, so to look at where the problematic decisions are being made. They're looking at behavioural economics to identify conduct that potentially might lead to poor consumer decision making. So what is being done in the organisations that are out there? What is the conduct that might facilitate that bad decision making, and how can that be corrected? They also use behavioural economics to respond to problems. So at the back end of the regulatory exercise, they're saying, what can we do? Well, this needs to be informed by the principles of behavioural economics. We need to make sure that the information is presented a certain way. We need to make sure that the conduct out there by organisations in this area is going to facilitate good decision making, and we'll make sure that that happens, even if we have to give a nudge to the consumers or a nudge to the organisations in order to make it happen. And one of the examples of, they call it not a nudge but a shove, was the whole implementation of the compulsory superannuation regime as something that was installed pretty much to make sure that the consumer had no choice but to engage in conduct that was in their own best interests. And I'll leave it to you to make up your own mind on the helpfulness or otherwise of the whole influence of behavioural economics on our regulatory scene. I'm sure it's something that we can talk about in the upcoming Zoom session. But that's all I really needed to draw your attention to in relation to this week's readings. The only other thing I will say is it's probably worthwhile having a little look at the Whitaker article if you're not across the current legislative intervention in the area of negligence, and more particularly in the area of calculating causation. Then you probably should have a little look at that Whitaker article. It goes through the Wallace and Cam High Court decision. That's about it for this week. If you have any problems or queries, please don't hesitate to email me or tweet me or post up something in the forums. Other than that, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to talk to you soon in one of the Zooms. Thanks, guys. Bye.